Hello, and welcome to episode 106 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I am Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
John, we're here to talk about the 2023 U.S. News Law School rankings. How do you feel about that?
I'm hot off the presses, man. Yeah, we've had these for less than a day at this point.
I'll tell you what annoys me about this is that it's March of 2022. But here we are in March of 2022, and they're the 2023 rankings. I'm like, just call it the year that they come out in.
Yeah, somebody sent me an email about that earlier, and my first thought was that's got to be a typo. But of course, it's the 2023 cycle rankings that we're discussing.
That's exactly right. And to get through this, both important and meaningless exercise in rankings that U.S. News goes through, we need some alcohol. So what are you drinking today?
Well, I need alcohol for far more reasons than just these rankings. I have yet to pack for a 2-week trip that I'm leaving on in the morning. So I need some stamina. So I've got a Red Bull and Belvedere vodka.
Is Belvedere the potato vodka?
I don't know. I'd have to go get
Or am I wrong about that?
Which seems
like Chopin or something?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if Belvedere's... What are the other options? Wheat? Corn?
It's vodka. People say, stop asking questions about it. Who cares if it comes potato or whatever?
Yeah. But yeah, that's me. I'm trying to perk up here. What about you?
Well, I've actually gone with a nod towards the rankings. I went out and I said, what is the most popular alcoholic drink in the world? And it turns out that it is beer. So I've gone with beer, and what I had was Stella Artois in the refrigerator. So that is what I'm drinking, which is pretty light. It's easy to drink, I'll say that much.
Yeah, I got to say I'm a little disappointed. You went with the most popular drink, but you didn't go with like the most popular beer, which would have to be what, Budweiser or something probably, right?
Yeah, but I didn't have any.
Maybe I'm not disappointed.
I wasn't going to go out and be like, I'm buying a special 6-pack of Bud.
I'm proud of you.
Because that one or maybe two would get drunk during this, and then those 4 would sit alone by themselves for several years.
That's a pure novelty purchase, I think. So
I like to drink it at sporting events because that's one of your few options, but generally not just sitting around.
Fair enough.
Unless it's really late and we're out of everything else.
Yeah, I'm trying to wake up, and I'm pretty sure Budweiser put me straight to sleep. So, yeah, good call there. Speaking of good calls, you also picked the song for today, and I thought it was inspiration. Touch of inspiration.
I think I got lucky. I've been listening to a lot of, I'd say, older music. Some of it's kind of like early 90s stuff. I've been listening to a lot of Faith No More recently for some reason. And then mixed into that, for no discernible reason, has been a bunch of Paul McCartney and Wings songs. And I realized that if we're talking about rankings, it's all about people wanting to rise up in the rankings. And so the song that I've chosen is, I think, an all-time classic, one of my favorite songs by Wings. It's called Let 'Em In from 1976. So really old.
There you go. And you never cease to surprise me. Some days it's Wings, some days it's Faith No More, some days it's K-pop. I would
rather have chosen K-pop. We could do these episodes, and every episode I could come up with a great K-pop song, but I realized that you would probably quit.
I don't think we'd make it to 109, frankly. This is
I'm not even sure we would have made it to
the
9.
End is near.
By 9, you would have been like, no more K-pop.
That's all I can handle.
In any event.
Yeah, so that's what's going on close to home. Let's talk a little broader. What's up in the LSAT world?
Well, by the time this comes out in the morning of Wednesday, March 30th, LSAT scores should be out and about. So obviously, we're looking forward to what we want to be a very happy score release. And I feel like there's decent chances of that based upon the test that they actually gave. It's not a huge group of test takers, so it's not going to be like pandemonium when scores come out. It's going to be one of the smaller test releases in history. But 9 a.m. Eastern time on the morning of Wednesday, March 30th, they will release the scores. And sometimes they come out a few minutes early, a few minutes late, but they all come out pretty quickly these days. So that'll be the big event the morning this happens. So you get the rankings released yesterday evening, really, a little bit early. They were supposed to come out at midnight, and they came out earlier than that. Right. And then less than 2 days later, you get a bunch of LSAT scores. And those two things kind of go together pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a nice dovetail with those two. With the rankings out now and you're starting to consider schools, you'll finally have your numbers to know where you stand. So that's great. For those of you who are still looking to take some LSATs, there are 2 more fast approaching. The next one coming up is in April. It starts on April 29th, which is a Friday, and then is going to run Friday and Saturday, so the 29th and the 30th. If you haven't signed up for it yet, I have some bad news. The registration passed about 2 weeks ago, March 16th. So if you're signed up, congrats, you made it. If not, you'll have to look to the June test. But the next one is April. You'll get scores back from April on May 18th, and then we turn right around and have one in June. The registration for that is still about a month out. April 27th is the June registration. And for now, that test is scheduled for Friday and Saturday, June 10th and 11th. I think, and I imagine you do too, they'll probably add another day to this.
100%. That'll be the return to sizable LSAT volume numbers. So I do think that we're going to get Friday, Saturday, Sunday out of that test ultimately. We'll have to see, though, and they're in no rush to add an additional date, and they won't do that until they actually start allowing the signups.
Right.
So we'll know the moment they allow signups what the day options are. But up until then, if you're like, hey, I'm still preparing for either April or June, we've got a number of webinars that you can attend for free. In fact, the day this podcast comes out, there's one in the evening that is going to be on comparative reading. So a little reading comprehension discussion. There's one on April 13th about circular games. There's another on April 26th that's basic LSAT 101. So if you're just getting into this, getting your feet wet, you can take that one. And of course, it's free. Just sign up at powerscore.com/free seminars. And then there is one in May as well that is on basic conditional reasoning on May 10th. And then, John, there's another one in later May that you and I are involved in, and that is on Tuesday, May 24th at 8 p.m. Eastern. You and I are going to do another crystal ball.
Yeah. We've been asked a lot about a crystal ball for the April test as well, because we just did one prior to March. And of course, what we've been happily able to tell people is that the one prior to March was really intended to apply for March and April. And the happiness part of this is that it still does. We didn't see anything happen in March that made us feel we had to release another one prior to April. I think every suggestion, recommendation, prediction from March in that webinar holds. But there's enough time passing before June that we're going to do another one.
Yeah, and if you're taking that April LSAT and you're like, well, where can I listen to that crystal ball? It is in all PowerScore online student centers. So if you're in one of our courses, if you're an analytics student, if you're an LSAT Bibles course student, that's all available for you there, as are the problem sets that go along with that.
Yeah.
And then when we do the crystal ball, after April, the test actually happens, and then we reset for the June LSAT. We'll change all of that according to what we see coming up in the June LSAT. So changes could be relatively minimal. They're usually somewhat on the medium side. Sometimes they're rather radical in terms of what we recommend that you focus on specifically. But just keep this in mind when we talk about problem sets that we're recommending people to do. They focus really on two primary areas. Things that we really think you should know in general, and we feel are like important seminal questions from the last several years, and then specific skill types that we're seeing them test a lot in experimentals that we think could be used. So it's not as if every game or logical reasoning question is designed for you to see it again exactly. Sometimes it's the mechanic inside of it. In other cases, we're like, you need to understand how this works because it'll make you a better LSAT taker. So it's a nice mixture there. And we've talked about that elsewhere, so I'll just leave that at that.
Yeah, I see a lot of times people do these quick sketch summaries and reduce it down to, they just say to review the most recent content. Just look at the most recent tests. And there's truth to that, but it's far more nuanced and far more targeted than such a blanket statement could ever do justice for. For instance, there's a game that we picked prior to the March test from all the way back in 2016. People who did that game at our recommendation were in really good shape when they got a close version of it in March. People who had never seen that game or had lost maybe some sense of it, March ate them alive with the repeat. So we know what we're doing, and we're very particular about the suggestions we make.
That's exactly right. And I think sometimes it's easy to misunderstand what the goal is of that. Right. It has multiple goals. It's a multifaceted thing we're attempting to do. It's not just like, this is exactly what's going to appear on your test. There is more to it than that. But we'll get to that in the crystal ball in another almost 2 months from now. It's a nice vacation from those for a while. Yeah. I like it.
You also know that it in a week, it's going to feel like it's right here. So,
yes, I do, especially because you're gone for basically the next 2 weeks. So that's going to eat up some time. But let's jump into the main event, which is the release of the U.S. News law school rankings, and this is their 2023 rankings, as I mentioned before. And so we're going to talk about a couple different factors here. We're going to talk about a little bit of the methodology that they use, why things move around, how they weight it, what that actually means. We'll do a little bit of an overview of the various groups like the T6, the T14, the T25, and the T50. And then we'll go through something that we started last year in reviewing this, which is my favorite part, winners and losers.
Yeah, mine too.
And that's all about the schools. Who won big in this little kind of like strange sweepstakes, and who were the big losers as well.
Yeah, I think something about this time of year puts us both in a bit of a competitive spirit, probably having to do with March Madness.
A little bit, of which these rankings are not all that dissimilar in the sense of like, well, you're an 8 seed, but now you're in the Final Four. So what does that actually mean? We'll have to see.
Yeah, I think we can probably use that analogy a few times as we go forward. So it's pertinent.
Yeah, well, you had a 15 seed get to the Elite Eight. That wasn't supposed to happen, and that had never happened before. So, I mean, usually it doesn't, but you see that with some of these schools. What's the difference between 20 and 25? I'm not really sure there is a huge difference, but a lot of times people put a lot of weight, especially on year-to-year movement.
Yeah.
Well, they went up 5 this year. That means a lot. I'm like, as we will see, some schools who jumped a lot last year dropped a lot this year. And so you can't just use 1 year of data. What you really want to do is when you look at something like that, you use a number of years where you see a school like rise and rise and rise and really change their position entirely because something's going on at those schools.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that 15th seed. I was thinking when the rankings came out that I think the only highlight of Kentucky's March was their law school went up 14 spots. Their basketball team, well,
dropped to the 15th.
Dropped to the 15th seed.
I'm not a Kentucky fan. I think listeners of this podcast may be aware that I went to Duke and I'm a Duke fan. So we'll have to see. Saturday night, feeling good about.
There you go. Yeah, still alive and kicking, although they've got their classic rivalry coming up.
First time they've ever met Carolina in the NCAA tournament.
That surprised me.
Yeah, considering how storied both of those programs are and how successful they've been, it's I think it was one that previously, that's the kind of meeting neither school really wanted. You don't want to lose that game.
Sure.
I personally did not pick Duke to get to the Final Four this year. After watching a number of the games, really all season long, they were great early in the year. And then in February and early March, they had some struggles. Then I was not a believer. Now I'm like, maybe it's just K's year. This is how you're supposed to go out when you're the greatest college coach of all time.
Playing their hearts out for Coach K's farewell.
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't mean to drag us down that little tangent.
Also, as a disclaimer, all you UCLA Wooden fans who took offense at me saying K was the greatest college coach of all time for men's basketball, I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know there's not an apology at the end of this sentence.
Different generation, different player skills, totally different environment.
All right, well, let's get back to the rankings. Let's talk methodology. And it changed a little bit year to year. In particular, I think they've actually reduced the number of factors or categories that they included in their algorithm, if you could call it that.
Yeah, they made a comment in their methodology that said that they had 20 kind of indicators that they used last year, and this year it's down to 14. And they break them out into these subgroups. And the thing I'm going to say about the methodology is it's interesting to consider what they are weighting, because people get really hung up on these rankings, and they do, to a great extent, drive things like acceptance rates at schools, hiring rates later on. A lot of this perception of quality is a big deal in the legal field. I'm going to point out, though, this is one organization's weighting of what they think is important. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the be-all, end-all. In fact, I think in a lot of arguments, their rankings aren't that great. There are schools that I think are better values or worse values. And Above the Law does a totally different type of outcomes-based ranking that I find very compelling whenever I come across it or refer to it. So let's just talk a little bit about the methodology, because a lot of times people just focus on what happened with the schools, and we're definitely going to do that. But I also want to, make sure that everybody has the table set as far as understanding this is what they're weighting, and this is what they think is important. And there are really 4 main areas, as they call it, that make up the kind of like the weighted rankings that they have. And the first and the biggest is what they call quality, which I find to be kind of comical. I'm like, oh, okay, so you're going to tell me the quality of a law school into a number? Sure you are. But that quality is 40% of the entire kind of like 100% of the rankings that they do, kind of like the metric that they produce. And when you get into that, it's broken into two numbers. 25% as a whole, not as a percentage of this, is peer assessment, what other law schools and administrators of law schools thought of your school. And then 15% of it is what lawyers and judges think. So 25 plus 15, that equals your 40% right there. And I will point this out, is that that's a really sketchy thing to rely upon, because if I'm working at Timbuktu Law School, do I really know how good Yale is? Or do I just think they're really good because, well, they seem to be getting great students and I hear a lot about them and, everybody seems to think that they're great. So a lot of times people are ranking schools that they don't know a whole lot about just on a direct sense. And then that's when we're talking about a school like Yale. What happens when that administrator is like, well, I don't know anything about, Villanova, or I don't have any personal knowledge of Kentucky's law school, but I guess last year they were ranked here, so I'm going to go ahead and rank them somewhere similar. It becomes very much the same thing year after year. And as far as the lawyers and judges component of this, sure. Tell me how much people who have been out practicing in the profession for 10, 15, 20 or more years remember law schools and have a current understanding of where the quality is, where the money's being sent, who are the administrators, who's on the up, who's on the down. So to me, I almost feel like they should just remove this assessment component, and I'd like to see what would happen once this quality component is gone. They won't do it, but that's my 2 cents on that.
I agree. Yeah, the 2/5 of this, essentially, by far the biggest component is, in many ways, almost like hearsay. It's sort of reputational rumor. When there are so many good metrics that they could be using, bar passage and employment and diversity and student-faculty ratios and LSAT and GPA numbers and all of it, and yet they're going to get out there and basically do a poll of people. That seems like such a poor way to do it when you have better metrics available.
Well, let's put it this way. If you look at all the individual indicators, all 14 of them, peer assessment at 25% and the lawyer and judge assessment at 15% are the two largest compared to all others. Nothing else is larger than either of those. Even things like bar passage, which you think that's pretty important, that's 3%.
Yeah.
So they're saying that the opinion of lawyers and judges who aren't in law school is 5 times as great as the bar passage rate, which is a metric that is updated every year and you can actually see physical changes.
Sure. Or 3 times as great as your debt when you get out, which I imagine if we polled one more group of people, which are the ones actually writing these checks, the students attending, I imagine they would put the weights a little differently here.
That's exactly right. So, if you've got 40% of your ranking based upon something that you called, I think quite appropriately, hearsay, I immediately questioned the validity of what you were doing. But that's the whole point, is that they want it to be questioned because that creates debate. Next year, they'll make a few little more small tweaks to it and the rankings will change a little bit more, and then there'll be more controversy about it. But it also means that when you look at these schools and you think number 1, number 2, number 3, you think, all right, that's a demonstrable difference, but it really isn't. These schools are super close in terms of how they are ranked, and they're closer together than further apart. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. There's a disclaimer section coming up, just to preface it. We'll talk a little bit about how much stock you should actually put in things where the rankings do become significant versus much more frequently where they don't. So know that all that's coming, but it's really built on the back of this idea that this is, this is not nearly as concrete and as objective as it could be, and I would argue as it should be.
Let's go to the next metric that they're weighing out, which is in total 26%. And this has got a couple different pieces to it. There's actually 5. The first 2 are employment rates. And I think this is a very important one.
Sure.
Employment rate at 10 months post-graduation is 14%. And then also employment rate at graduation is 4%. So combined employment rates are 18%, but they are broken down into individual components, the largest of which is 14. I think this should be much, much higher because the point of going to law school is to get a job. And ultimately that job, whether it's immediately upon graduation or within a year or so of graduation, is going to have a tremendous impact on everybody. To have that as a total of 18%, less than 1/5, and yet to have 2/5 of it based upon people's opinions, right. I'm like, why do we avoid the hard data here? But that's the first part. Bar passage is also 3%. They fooled around a little bit with kind of like what they're doing with bar passage rate. And then debt totals, which I think is another very important number. There's two different types of debt totals that come in, but it's a very small percentage. Overall, it's about 5%. Yeah. One of the debt totals is the percentage of people to law school who graduate with debt. And then the other percentage is the average debt that they have. So how many people as a percent have debt, and then what's that number itself? And we'll talk a little bit more about debt and how it affected one of the schools, or perennially has been affecting one of the schools. Sure. So yeah, that's so, I mean, at that point, you're at 2/3, essentially, between quality and what they would call placement. You're at 66%. Yeah, so let's take a look at the remaining 34%. There you go. That would be selectivity is the bigger portion here. It's 21%. And guess what this is? This is your median LSAT and GRE, your median GPA, and your acceptance rate are the three different elements that are used. So these three things, which are, again, quantifiable, are 21%. How does this stack up? I think it's kind of interesting. Your median LSAT/GRE is 11.25%. And they weight it according to, like, if you had 80% LSAT takers and 20% GRE, then the LSAT is 80% of your number. So that's 11.25%. How does your median GPA as a school stack up? Well, is it the same? As most people, I think, would guess, if they've listened to us, certainly they would know. It's less. The question is it surprisingly less? Like the percentage for the median GPA in terms of its weight is 8.75%. And again, compared to LSAT, which was 11.25, it's about a 2.5% difference. Yeah. So, like 25, 30% less of importance. Think about that. Once again, I will say somewhat comically to me, I don't know, I'm bemused by it. A 4-hour test, and really it's not even 4 hours anymore. No. 3 hours max, and that's with proctor problems, is more important than 4 or 5 years of schooling for most people. Just let that sink in for a second and then ask yourself exactly how accurate rankings that are produced on this type of basis actually can be. I question, the validity. And then the last part is acceptance rate, which almost seems like a pittance. It's 1%. I know. It feels like they had to, basically, is what that says to me. Yeah, they wanted something here. I probably, if I was doing this, would have focused more on like yield. How many people who actually get accepted want to go to the school. But I understand that no matter what number you use here, you're asking for trouble. And so that's part of the problem of trying to rank something that is inherently non-quantifiable, meaning a law school in quantifiable terms with the rankings. Yeah, let me make one more comment in this category, because we talked about median GPA, but I think that can be a little misleading for someone who doesn't understand what we mean. That's really median undergraduate GPA. Put another way, there's a kind of conspicuous absence here when you're talking about the numbers that you submit, which is anything post-grad. If you've gone to graduate school, if you've got a PhD, the grades that you got after college don't factor in here. Yeah, and for a couple of reasons, by the way. First off, not everybody has them. Sure. So it's not a universal marker. So they don't want to have that kind of thrown in there. And then secondarily, it is widely thought that graduate school GPAs are inflated. And so if they allowed them to be factored in, they would end up, schools would change their admissions policies to start selecting applicants who had high graduate GPAs in order to kind of like puff up that number. So, which is really weird because that's the tail wagging the dog. U.S. News makes a change in the ranking methodology, and all of a sudden a law school makes a change in the type of applicants that it accepts. And that may sound kind of like, what? A dystopian almost, but that's exactly how it works. When they make changes, these schools are like, what are they doing? Okay, we can adjust to that. They're looking for every little edge, and sometimes, a 1/10 of a point moves them up. Sure. And that's all. They'll go for it. Yeah. That's their job, and people lose their jobs over these rankings. People at the law schools, yeah, they do. Yeah, and get better jobs according to if they are able to take a school up and up and up, then they get, moved over and recruited.
That question just comes up so frequently, though. Like, what about my, graduate degree in X? Is this going to matter? I had a 3.2 in college, but a 4.0 in grad school. You're a 3.2, I'm afraid.
Yeah, you're a 3.2. The grad degree is a plus, but it's not a game changer at all.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, okay, that's nice. Okay, you did well, but they just assume that graduate GPAs are inflated, which is unfair because not all of them are, but some of them are, and that's where the problem is.
Yeah. There's one final category.
Yeah. The last of the four big. We had quality at 40%, placement at 26%, selectivity at 21%, and now we get to faculty, law school, and library resources, which is the final 13%. And this has got a bunch of interesting numbers. The first one is average spend on services for students. That's at 9%. Another is average spend on all other elements, including financial aid, which is 1%. And this bothers me because this almost explicitly says that financial aid is not a huge component that the school should focus on. And looking at some of the schools this year, not to name check anybody, but I saw some schools that seem to have dropped their financial aid packages a little bit. And it's interesting to see, was that related to this? And then we've got student faculty ratio. How many people are in the room at 2%? And then finally, the ultra critical library resources, John, bringing up the march of the Army to 1%.
If you mean ultra critical in terms of how we've talked about this particular factor, we have been ultra critical.
Yeah, well, I'm being facetious, obviously.
It's down, though. It was 1.7% last year, down to 1% this year. So at least it's trending in the right direction.
I have it on good authority that they heard our criticism and immediately moved to change the methodology here.
Are you being facetious about that?
100%.
Okay. We've seen them make enough policy changes based on the things we have loudly said.
I've seen LSAC do that.
Yeah.
LSAC's done that, I think, on more than one occasion. I haven't seen U.S. News do it, but we certainly did squawk about the library resources being ridiculous. and I will say this expenditure on services and other elements, including financial aid, our friend Mike Spivey at Spivey Consulting has said, he's like, this is a real question mark because this is unaudited and it's hard to say what schools put in there. How you define the category could have had a huge impact on the number that you reported. And so he's kind of called for maybe that to be examined or perhaps audited a little bit more closely or perhaps having more of a unifying standard put in place.
Yeah, the murkiness of it concerns me a bit.
Yeah, so I think if you listen to our discussion of the methodology, you get a really strong sense that, I think rankings are fun. They're interesting. It's just like looking at a March Madness bracket, but take it with a big grain of salt because there's plenty of upsets in March Madness and there's plenty of inaccuracies in this type of methodology. It is arbitrary. The people at U.S. News have made these choices not for any particular reason other than, hey, this is what we think works. You and I could produce our own rankings that would take all the same data and come up with completely different rankings if we so chose to weight it that way. So it's a huge grain of salt.
Yeah.
And I think, that's something we'll talk a little bit more right now because I think it's a perfect kind of segue there.
Yeah, completely. This is the disclaimers part that I alluded to before. And I think the biggest question that gets asked, and the biggest question that should be asked, is really how much stock should someone listening to this put into these rankings? How much should they affect your decisions? What kind of influence should this have over the ultimate choices you make about schools you're applying to or schools you choose to attend based on your acceptances and things? And I do want to make a quick separation between an applicant and the school itself. Schools put a lot of stock in these rankings. As you've said, people lose jobs and get promoted based on how their school performs in the eyes of U.S. News, which is crazy to me. So they behave in a way based on the metrics we just said. If they increased, say, their LSAT percentage as a contributing factor, schools would weigh the LSAT more. If they added something like, instead of financial aid being 1%, we're going to make it 8%. You would see schools become more generous to improve their standings. So schools are a different animal entirely than the audience that we're actually intending this for.
Yeah, schools won't care.
No.
They know that this has a bottom line impact to them, even in the terms of the number of applicants they might get the following year. So they will treat it the way that it needs to be treated as part of their professional lives and to be recognized and dealt with appropriately. But for the audience that we're really talking about, which is applicants and prospective law students, just don't get hung up on the idea that, this school that's number 1 versus this school that's number 8. Oh, they're totally different. They're really not. The differences here are minor. The best school for you isn't necessarily the highest ranked school. It might be, but that's not because it's the highest ranked school. That's almost incidental. It's about what the best fit is overall. The best, kind of like fellow students, the best location for you, the best environment. It's all about succeeding. If somebody says to me, well, I can go to the number 8 school and I know I'm going to really do well, versus I might think I'm going to struggle at the number 1 school. Well, look, struggling at any school is not going to help you. Doing well at any school is going to help you on a relative basis. So don't just say, well, that's the number 8 school, I'm going to go there, and that number 10 school, sorry, they're out. That is the wrong way to use this. Use it for what it is, almost an entertaining kind of look and a big picture look at how the legal field does tend to kind of think about these schools in these bunches. And we'll get to that with like the T6, the T14, and so forth in just a moment.
Yeah, you talk a lot about potential success or struggle, but I would say the same is true of financial decisions too. Do you go to a school just because it's in the top 10, but you have to pay full price when you could have gone to a school 17 with a scholarship? The prestige versus scholarship thing, and it comes up a lot, so much so it might be our most popular blog article ever. I think it's certainly leading the comment count.
It's number 1 in comments of all time.
So it's an article that Dave wrote essentially helping people to get a better sense of how to weigh those two things. Is ranking more important than debt, essentially? And trying to figure out exactly where the scales would shift. And some of it is pretty clear cut. Some of it's not. But it's very rare that we would ever tell somebody to go to a better school simply because, better in air quotes, go to a school simply because it has a higher ranking with no other consideration to the additional factors.
I've never said that.
Yeah, I don't think I have either.
Yeah, I think I wrote that post several years ago, but every time we get to this point in the year, there's always new comments on it. In fact, there was a comment on it, I think 2 days ago that I responded to where someone was going through the list of schools, and I go through that and I will break it down. Can't always break everyone's down. And sometimes I'm like, we've done this kind of question before, but remarkably enough, there's enough information when you look at the comments there, and I'm many of the comments on there because I tend to respond to people who write on that post. It does, kind of give you a methodology for making decisions.
Right.
How do you measure debt versus ranking? What are you really buying? And I try to break it down in that article and in the comments that says there is a way to quantify all this, because if you're going to say, all right, I'm going to pay full boat to go to the number 10 school versus a full scholarship for the number 30 school, well, you can quantify that. What are you getting? You're paying this many dollars, $150,000 or more at a minimum. But then what are you buying? You're buying employment rates that are usually higher. You're buying better outcomes, but not for certain, just chances. And that's very dangerous. But that's the way to do that. And that's something to really think about. It's never about rankings. It's about the actual realities of outcomes.
Yeah, that post is going to be, it's evergreen, man. That post is me getting comments long after we've both shuffled off. So
that's a perfect description of it. Evergreen. I love that.
I'm certain.
Well done.
But yeah, so the point really being is that some of these rankings and the movement and stuff, they look very definitive, very decisive. But the fact is they really are, I think, far less revealing or indicative of the choices you should make than the numbers alone might suggest.
Yeah. And speaking of the numbers, it's easy to look at parts of these rankings and think, well, they looked at LSAT, they looked at GPA, they looked at debt, bar passage, employment rates at various points after you graduate and think, oh, yeah, it's quantitative. Well, sure, there's a quantitative component to it, but that is really watered down when you have 40% being opinion just straight out of the gate, from peers and lawyers and judges, this expert opinion, so to speak. Is it really, though? Are they really experts in law school rankings? No. They just happen to be in the legal field, so all of a sudden they qualify. That really takes the quantitative element here and makes it a lot less important and influential. So just keep that in mind with the huge grains of salt that you should be eating along with these rankings. On that note, let's get into some of the broad strokes, John.
Yeah, let's do it. We'll break this down categorically, but within the top 50. I think that's a fair place to cut this off. And then, as you said before, we'll get into what I think is our mutually favorite part, the winners and losers discussion, who's really come out ahead.
Exactly. And I will point out that when we say things like T50, it is based upon these rankings where they basically do the first 3 quartiles and then they take the 4th quartile, the bottom 25% of schools, and then just put them in that quartile and they don't rank them. So when we use terms such as T6, that's the top 6 schools. Mm-hmm. That is the traditional top 6. We've got some changes there this year that will come up. T14 refers to the top 14 schools, which has very traditionally been the same 14 schools. And it is back to those 14 schools this year, although there's a little bit of movement. T25 is exactly what you think. It's the top 25 schools, and the T50 is the top 50 schools in the rankings.
Perfect. Yeah. Needed clarification. So let's start at the top. What's going on? And no surprises at the number 1 spot. Yale stands alone at number 1, which is pretty much just perennial. They've been up there for a long time. There used to be some competition for the first spot, but I think Yale's sort of distanced itself a little bit. Stanford in the number 2 spot stays there as well. So nothing new at 1 and 2. Stanford's a solo second.
Yeah, and in the past, Harvard has been up, at number 2, but Stanford is kind of cemented in this position. And, Yale and Stanford are both smaller law schools than Harvard, which could be playing a role here. But, how did Harvard do? They number 3 like they have been?
Well, yeah, number 3 is where things start to take some historical turns, in fact. There is a number 3, but it's a new one. It's Chicago. Chicago is in the solo spot at number 3, which, for as long as I've been paying attention to this, is the highest I've ever seen for Chicago.
I believe that is the case. And that means that the first kind of I don't know whether it's a real one or just a perceived earthquake, is that Harvard's not in the top 3. They are now 4th.
Yeah.
And they're tied with Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
So, you take a look at that for a moment, and has Harvard changed at all? Is Harvard just demonstrably different than last year? They're now out of the top 3. They're not even a top 3 law school, John. Harvard sucks.
It is funny. The kind of acronym or the abbreviation for I want to go to the best law school in HYS. That was just always what people say. Harvard, Yale, Stanford, HYS. No, it's like CYS now, I guess. Or YSC if you do it in order.
Yeah, the thing I always laugh about with Harvard is it's probably the most recognizable American school worldwide. Mm-hmm. You go to Harvard and then all of a sudden you're working in Amsterdam, they've heard of it. You're in England, they've heard of it. That didn't change. People weren't like, Harvard, they're not even T3 anymore. So this is where the comedy of these rankings kind of comes into play. And it could very well be that next year, as these rankings move around, as they do every year, Harvard moves back up. They could be back into the top 3 next year. And in fact, I'd probably bet money that they will be.
Yeah, I think so too. I sent a text to a tutoring student of mine who's in her 2nd year at Harvard now. And I said, I got some really bad news. You've made a horrible mistake. Send her the link to the rankings.
She was already crying even before that text message showed up, John. They'd heard the news on campus.
I just wanted to confirm her disappointment. I can't believe she would do something so
You wanted
foolish.
to rub it in.
Yeah.
Didn't you know their rankings were going to drop? Why did you choose to go there?
Salt the wound.
So if I'm sitting here and I'm
laugh about it, again, how arbitrary some of this stuff is.
Yeah, but you think about it. If I was on the fence between Harvard and Chicago right this minute and I saw this, you want to know the percent impact this would have on me? 0.
I would assume.
Yeah, I wouldn't care one bit. I would choose Harvard or Chicago based upon which school I thought was better for me and that I was likely to do better at.
Sure.
It would have nothing to do with rankings. And this is why you can hear the lightly or maybe heavier mocking tone that we're both using in relation to some of this. I find it an interesting thought exercise, but Harvard being out of the top 3 is meaningless to me.
Yeah, unless, again, you could look at a school like this and see that the change was brought about by something that would be impactful. Let's say Harvard had changed their tuition substantially, or Chicago started offering a lot more scholarships, something that could move the needle in a way that would actually affect you. Well, then suddenly these differences in ranking might hold some legitimate weight. That would influence me, for instance.
Yeah, let's think about Yale for a second. This is a school, Yale Law School specifically, that is having some real severe issues with the student body. Very divisive things occurring there. A lot of news coming out of New Haven about various law school professors, students, student groups, and without commenting upon, the value or the validity of any of those particular entities, it's been a lot of controversy, which is distracting. And, emails going around and around among students. And certainly there's a lot of great articles, whether it's been on Above the Law or elsewhere, talking about this. But none of that controversy, which I consider to be somewhat of, I don't want to go to a law school that's constantly in the news for something that isn't, overly positive. That's you can't account for that. And for some students, Yale is and always will be the best place they could possibly go to. And for others, it won't. But there are things that are happening culturally that aren't even being measured, no matter what your value system is in terms of looking at this.
Yeah, it could come back to bite Yale when those people graduate and find themselves in the peer assessment polls.
I've seen some Yale grads expressing, unhappiness. And of course, when people get older, they always are expressing unhappiness about the youth, of the country in the US or Canada. They're like, those kids. And so I always take that with my own grain of salt when I listen to somebody's criticism. I'm like, is it just that you're getting older and you just don't tolerate anything? You don't necessarily know what's really going on the ground. But there's been article after article about Yale recently. Yeah. And a lot of them have not been overly positive. That doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. But that takes us through the top 4, which, again, from at least my own recollection, probably has the most movement within it that I've seen in a long time. And some movement continues. NYU, for instance, dropped out of the top 6. They have now dropped down to number 7. It's a single spot. They were 6th last year. But, again, movement.
And you talked about HYS, and that was the top 3 schools. Well, 4, 5, and 6 were always CCN. So you had Chicago, Columbia, and NYU there, and all of a sudden NYU's out of the top 6. Now, has NYU suddenly gotten tremendously worse than they were last year?
No, of course not. The only thing that's really changed here, I think, is that U.S. News continues to adjust the algorithm. And that moves schools around despite schools staying largely consistent. That's my interpretation.
No, I understand that. I've never been the biggest NYU fan. So for me, I'm like, let's just see what happens next year. But, Penn came in and has taken that spot that NYU used to have. They're now 6th. And you've got a couple other schools that are kind of floating up there, floating around. You got UC Berkeley at 9, Michigan at 10, stayed the same. And I guess Penn was at 6 before, but they're now solo 6.
Solo 6 now. They were tied with NYU last year. So they stayed steady. NYU dropped a spot.
And then you got a couple, also notable was that Duke and Northwestern both dropped a spot. And I think Duke got, in my opinion, at least lucky here. Obviously, I'm a Duke fan, and so I'd like to see their law school remain highly ranked. And I was a little concerned with last year's cycle because it sure seemed to me they admitted a lot of people early last year who did not have the median numbers that they seem to be aiming for later in the cycle. And so for them to only drop a spot is, I think, a minor victory for them. Northwestern, same type of outcome there, went from 12 down to 13.
Yeah.
And then you had some gainers at the bottom. Cornell and Georgetown both gained up a spot.
That's right.
Big for Georgetown, especially because they moved back into the top 14. They are now 14th. They swapped spots with UCLA, which they'd swapped spots the year before. That's so right. They're in a battle.
Back and forth, Georgetown and UCLA. And UVA stayed steady at number 8 as well. So, again, about half the schools, maybe a little more than half the schools in the top 14 stayed where they were. The others moved around maybe one position.
And I think if you look at a school like Georgetown, they had such an interesting cycle last year and really good results overall. I thought that it was possible that they would move up further than 14th. That didn't happen, which in part, when 40% of it is based upon what people who really aren't even, so much, knowledgeable about Georgetown is saying that it's hard to break that perception. Well, Georgetown's always 14th. Well, if that's what people think, they will continue to always be 14th because that's just who they are at this point.
Yeah. Well, there you go. There's our T14 and a little bit of 15 with UCLA getting a nod. Let's expand it a little bit. Let's go deeper. Top 25. And I don't think we have to talk about the next 11 schools on the list. Let's just hit the biggest movers.
Tell me what they were.
Well, I believe, I don't know if it's the biggest move, but it's one of them certainly. It's not the biggest, but it's a big one. Boston BU gained 3 spots to jump up into a tie for number 17. So pretty good. They're tied with University of Texas and Vanderbilt, both of which dropped down to 17. So now you've got this traffic jam, this log jam at 17, which Boston has found its way into.
Yeah, and Texas had been higher than 16 previously, so they're having a slow drop, which might be cause for consternation. Oh my God, they've dropped a few places over the last several years. No, it doesn't matter. They're still the same school. They still have plenty of state resources. They're always being hampered by the fact that a lot of their grads stay in Texas, and they don't have the national profile at a school like Penn or Berkeley or Duke or whoever actually has. That's always going to be the problem with them.
Yeah, for sure. Having a opposite problem, I suppose, is BYU, who continues to make huge strides forward. The biggest gainer, in fact, in the top 25 was Brigham Young. They gained 6 points this year, so they are up to number 23. But I think this really comes into perspective when you consider that last year, I believe they had gained 8. So in 2 years, they've increased 14 spots. And we'll talk more about some of the reasons on BYU later. But know that they're making some significant progress towards the front of the line here.
Yeah, and then at the kind of like the tail end of the T25, you got GW moved up 2 spots, and they're now tied in the top 25. Again, this is one of the attractive DC schools. Right after Georgetown, you've got GW. It's right downtown. It's, the nation's capital, all the political power centers around it. Interesting place to be from a legal standpoint. And then Notre Dame dropping, almost slipping out of the top 25. They've now dropped 3 positions from 22 to 25, and they're in a tie at 25. Again, small movements. Who knows what happens next year?
I'm glad you brought that up about George Washington. I want to make a quick point because we talked a little bit about Texas, and maybe one of the reasons their rankings are suffering a little bit is the fact that they don't maybe have the national recognition. But to put, say, Texas and GW side by side, despite the fact that they're 8 points apart in the ranking, 8 spots apart, they serve very different audiences in terms of ambitions or career goals. If I knew I wanted to work in politics or somehow get involved in that, even though GW is a worse ranked school than Texas, GW probably makes more sense to attend.
Yeah, it's, that's one of those things, the nuances of it are really difficult. Obviously, Texas is, in Austin, it's in the state capital, so they have their political, aspects and aspirations, but it's the state capital versus GW is in the nation's capital. And, there's all sorts of orgs there that are doing legal work. And so there's a lot of opportunities. The big issue is that with Texas, that they're essentially the most recognized school in the state. I think Houston's, on the move, but Texas still has them in the kind of like that Southwest area and really in a lot of the bordering states too. Like they are the big school down in that general area, whereas GW is not even the most notable school in their town. You got Georgetown that's not too far away from them. And Georgetown's big. So they're putting out hundreds and hundreds of graduates every year. So GW, just from that perception standpoint, they already start behind them. And then, of course, you got people from all sorts of other Northeastern schools. Many of them are top 14 schools who are like, DC's where I want to work. It's that competition, more jobs, but more competition for those jobs. So it really depends upon what you're looking at and some of the interests that you have and whether or not you'd like Austin better than DC, which I like both towns. I used to live in DC and I think it's great. So I don't know which way I would go there.
I'm strongly considering a move to Austin. So let's circle back to that conversation. We can both claim residence.
I don't think I'd move to either at this juncture in my life, but living in DC was truly special times.
I wonder if I'll get some messages from people trying to talk me in or out of that decision.
And for whatever it's worth, for those of you down in Texas, specifically Austin, I love Austin too. This is not anti-Austin. Been there many times. Think it's a great town. Love the live music aspect. So
yeah, I don't think I've ever met anybody who's anti-Austin. I've certainly never liked anyone who was anti-Austin.
Yeah, I think sometimes people are turned off a little bit by the countercultural vibe. They keep Austin weird, and I'm like, I like that. So
I'm into it. But yeah, enough about us. It does speak to the point, though, about consider more than just rankings when you start to look at where you want to maybe attend. Consider the town, consider the opportunities, consider the reputation of what it's likely to produce in terms of job prospects and things, even industry.
Yeah.
So
So let's do a quick roundup of the notable moves in that kind of like T26 to T50 area.
Yeah, this feels like concentric circles, and we're just expanding out now.
That's exactly what they are. And then right after this won't take long, and then we'll jump into the winners and losers, which I think is fun because then you can pile on certain schools. So I thought one of the most notable drops here out of the top 25 was Arizona State.
Yeah,
moving from 25 down to 30. And I'm very interested that they'd had a really solid rise over the last several years. I think, maybe they ran out of money a little bit. They spent a lot of money kind of securing students over the years. I felt like this year I seem to feel as if they weren't as generous as they had been in the past. I don't know that that's what drove this because I don't have the full data in front of me, but I'd be really interested in seeing the metrics underneath their ranking and what was different compared to last year. So that was one that you had. You also had some risers here. George Mason, another DC area school, although not downtown, had a big jump up 11 places from 41 to 30. And right along with them was Ohio State, who moved up 10 places to number 30. So those two schools had a pretty big jump there.
The two biggest gains in the top 50, in fact.
Yeah, those were the big movers. They were the big T50 winners to some extent. You have BC, all right, so another Boston area school, they dropped 8 spots to 37. So getting, out of the top 20 for that, the top 30 rather, for them, down to 37. And then the biggest dropper in the top 50, which I chuckle about, was Wisconsin, down 14. And we'll get a little bit more to that. Since I'm from Minnesota, of course I'm going to laugh when Wisconsin goes down a little bit.
But that's a pretty heavy hit. We'll talk more about Wisconsin, but they dropped 14 all the way to number 43 from 29 last year. That's substantial. I know you're shedding tears.
A lot of my friends from high school went to Madison, Madtown. Never was for me.
But I think that's a pretty good overview, at least, of the most notable things in the top 50.
I'd say so. And so, again, take it all with a big grain of salt because these movements we can make, down 8, up 11, but they can be statistically very small incremental changes that fueled those rises and falls there. That said, since we're doing this, we're going to have fun with it. And I think the most enjoyable part is the winners and losers. And that's what we've arrived at now, John. So let's start talking about the winners. Who's one of your big winners here?
Well, let's start up near the top. And we touched on this already, but I think Chicago's got to be feeling awfully good right about now. To move into a solo third place, which I think is the highest I've ever seen them, as I said. And that's just a straight up victory. So I'm sure there's some champagne popping in the admissions office there around Chicago at this point.
Look, if you're at law school and you've moved ahead of Harvard in anything other than dropouts, you got to be feeling good about things.
Yeah.
I would imagine it's more than champagne. They're probably taking shots down there and enjoying themselves.
Yeah. If we go a little bit deeper into the top 20, I think you'd have to say the biggest winner overall, at least in terms of gains, was BU. To have jumped 3 spots into number 17, that's impressive.
And you might think to yourself, listening, like, why is that impressive? It's because it's really hard to move inside the top 20. Like, it's easy to move a spot or two, but to make multiple place jump like that, statistically, these schools are all very good. They have incredible resources, and they are focused on maintaining that. So to move 3 spaces in there is not an easy thing to actually happen.
Yeah.
So for them, I imagine, unlike their friends over at BC, BU is feeling very good. They're also taking shots today.
That's right. Yeah. So if we're going to do it by city, I think the only people in Boston who are having a good time right now is probably the BU folks.
And that's right. Excellent. Because at Harvard, they're drinking their own tears.
Yes, they are.
And that's our first loser is Harvard. Because, this isn't happening for them this time around. I do think they'll be back in the T3 next year. As I said before, I don't think this changes anything. But somebody somewhere, in this case at US News, said you're no longer in the top 3. And so it's rare for us to put Harvard in any type of loser category. Mm-hmm. But in this case, for our purposes, yes, they're our first loser.
This one stings too. Anybody around Harvard knows that they pride themselves on reputation. So this one cut deep, despite the fact that, again, for the people listening to this, it doesn't really matter.
Also, running that same loser race is NYU, because they can't be thrilled to just be officially out of the T6. And I don't recall the last time that happened, years ago for sure. And again, I feel like there's a decent chance that they will inch back in, but I've been really impressed with some of the people that I've worked with who've gone to Penn and have graduated from Penn that I've worked with in recent years. We have a couple of admissions consultants that are Penn grads, and I've been super impressed with how sharp they are. So it doesn't surprise me that Penn would slip into that spot and take sole possession of it. But both Harvard and NYU, when you have moves in the T6 like this and you move out, you got to be a loser, at least in the way we're rating it.
It's a historic year in the top 6. 3 people, and there's 3 schools in positions that I don't think I've ever seen them before. Chicago 3rd, Harvard 4th, NYU not in the 6th, now they're 7th. All 3 of those I think are somewhat historical.
Let's go back to the winner side, and we'll stick inside the T14. I say Georgetown is a winner here, because that T14 has just been the parlance that people use to refer to those schools. And by the way, they refer to them that way because for years, historically, those schools were always the top 14 schools. And then a few years back, you saw Texas slip in to that 14th spot, knock Georgetown down. And Georgetown got it back, and then UCLA came in and grabbed that spot. And so here we are, Georgetown back in the top 14. And I think that they had a really strong admissions year, like I said. I thought maybe they'd even move up to the 13th spot. That didn't happen for them, but I think they're still feeling good that, hey, we're back in our spot. I feel like that they believe that's their territory.
Yeah. And again, this is the kind of thing, as middling or arbitrary as it probably ultimately is. This is the kind of thing that is a big deal to these people. For Georgetown to be 15th and lose to UCLA last year, I know that stung, and I don't know if all of their policy decisions were based on this rankings idea to get back into the T14, but I'm sure it was at least a factor.
It's interesting. I don't know Dean Kornblatt personally, but he seems like a really affable guy. He's probably taking shots today.
It's going to be a hungover Wednesday at Georgetown.
And they got work to do still, because there is a lot of admits and admissions decisions still to be made in this incredibly slow cycle that we're kind of like suffering through.
Yeah, that wait list isn't going to thin itself, boys. So,
John, if Georgetown's a winner, who's got to be a loser?
Well, I mean, it was one or the other, pretty much guaranteed. And this year, it's UCLA. These two were in the exact opposite positions last year. We called UCLA a winner, Georgetown a loser last year. They've switched. And UCLA has dropped from 14th to 15th. And so there you go. It stings a little bit from my pals down the street.
Yeah, that is the school that is physically closest to your location. And for the last decade, they've been ranked between 17th and 15th. So to have moved up and go into the 14 was a big thing. Although I really feel like this is a school that's entrenched in this kind of like 15 to 18 range. And so I don't know that they're crying too hard. They're probably like, darn, we had it. But, like I said, Georgetown was having quite a year last year. And so just because Georgetown went up and UCLA dropped out of that 14, we'll call it a loss. But I don't think this is a stinging loss. I think this is a darn.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll get over it.
I think the loss for UCLA was probably less significant than the win for Georgetown.
It's kind of like St. Peter's losing here in the Elite Eight. They're like, well, we went so far. We're really happy. We wanted to get to the Final Four, but we had to have a Duke Carolina setup. So darn that we lost to Carolina.
There you go. Let's get back to some winners. Speaking of Duke and Carolina, one of the ones that we just have to draw attention to, and we already touched on it, but now we can elaborate, and that's Brigham Young, BYU. Up 14 spots in 2 years. This year they jumped 6. Last year they jumped 8. And that puts them now at number 23, all the way up from 37 just 2 years ago.
And you and I were talking about this beforehand. One of the things that is very appealing about BYU is the financial aspect. I don't know if I could live the lifestyle, John, and I know you couldn't. But if you look at it from how much it costs to go to what is a undoubtedly quality law school, this is maybe the best deal in the country. Yeah,
they'd throw me out at orientation, but
you'd get to orientation? Wow, not. I wouldn't even make it.
I don't know, they'd let me on campus. But
they wouldn't even allow me on the plane to head to Utah.
That's right. I'm banned from the state. But it is extremely affordable, especially if you're a member of the LDS Church. It's like 14 grand a year, I think, which is by far the best deal among top law schools going.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm a big fan of BYU in this sense that I don't really want people to go to law school and come out with these huge debt loads. And BYU is one of those options that if you understand the lifestyle and the expectation there, and I think it's important that anybody who's considering going there does understand it. If you're an LDS member, then you're already in that. And so it would be, I think, relatively easy. But if you're not, you need to know what it is that the expectations are. And if that's something that isn't a problem for you or that you can certainly abide by, it's a fantastic deal and it is a very good school.
Mm-hmm. So continues to prove it. If these rankings mean anything, then BYU is, again, demonstrably great.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And they're seeing some benefits of this. And, we think that student debt is the low figures are playing a role in helping drive them up. But, that low debt also could be driving some of their admissions numbers up. And it certainly helps when you're like, well, I can go to BYU and it's going to cost me under $20,000 for 3 years versus some other school that's $150,000. And all of a sudden, you might want to think to yourself, well, maybe this is actually the better choice. And Utah is beautiful. So that whole area is gorgeous. There's a lot to be said for that particular school. You and I might make some light joking about, well, they won't let us in the state. But that has no reflection whatsoever on the quality of what they're doing over there.
No. And in fact, I would be quite disappointed if they didn't let me into the state because I think it's probably the best skiing in the country.
I don't know. Colorado might have some things to say about that.
They might. There are a couple of neighboring schools, at least in terms of the range here, from the 20 to 30 range. There are two other winners that we just need to touch on. One, you mentioned George Mason, up 11, now into a tie for 30th. And then Ohio State up to a tie for 30th by gaining 10. My understanding of George Mason, and I'm sure this had a role, and kudos to him, is I believe they pulled in a new dean from Alabama who's made some changes around there. And again, if these rankings are anything to go by, are working.
Yeah, I think our friend Mike Spivey had mentioned something like that. And if you don't think that law school deans really have an impact or think about stuff like rankings, you are wrong.
Yeah.
Take a school like Florida. They've had a pronounced rise in the rankings, and they have a dean who does a really great job and is focused on some of those aspects and really wants the school to have a bigger reputation. And if you're a school like Florida, for example, you've got a lot of resources. You're a state school with a big name nationally. You're on TV every weekend. Even if that's not the law school football team out there, it is the university football team out there. People automatically are aware of Florida. And so it's easy to take a school like that and move them up the rankings if you start putting money into it. ASU saw that same type of thing. They started putting money into it.
Yep.
You see not just George Mason here, you see Ohio State, another school that has some power. I've seen some of the Pennsylvania schools, not UPenn, but the Penn State school system make some big jumps in the last few years because they started to actually financially support, the goals that they had. And money talks, and it can make a difference, and it can change these metrics that are out there. So Mason up 11, Ohio State up to 10, now both tied at 30. I imagine they're also taking shots today.
Yeah, you've got to think, too. I mean, this is to the school's benefit. This is something of a self-perpetuating type of success, which is if you go from number 40 to number 30, or in the case of George Mason, 41 to 30, you're going to attract better applicants. You're going to have a better pool of people in terms of, again, credentials to choose from. That's what I mean by better. I don't necessarily mean anything to do with the people themselves.
Agreed. And, at least on our who's drinking today and who's not, the big winner who's not drinking is BYU, but that's because they don't. So they are a big winner, no doubt, but in this case, they're not taking shots, I'm sure.
There you go.
Nor should
Seltzer shots.
I don't want anyone to get any trouble there.
Let's talk about Wisconsin, because we have moved out of the winners group and we have to address Wisconsin, which was the biggest fall within the top 50. Again, no love lost on your end, I don't think, but I know they've got to be disappointed to drop all the way from in the 20s to now in the 40s, from 29 to 43. And it, I think, stings particularly because just a year ago, they had actually gained 9 spots.
Yeah, they're my yo-yo award winner of the year.
That's a good way to put it.
They up 9 last year and now down 14. They're jumping all over the place.
This pendulum that is Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I like to make fun of Wisconsin lightly just because, essentially from Minnesota. But I lived in Wisconsin for a while, so I can't even say that I've never been there. And Minnesota and Wisconsin are really the same state, except some people are Packers fans, and then the people on the left side are
some people
Vikings
are right.
fans. And some people are right. So
all right.
Don't get me started on the Packers. But this is, it's tough for them. They go up 9 spots, and then all of a sudden, this is the biggest drop in the top 50. And they move right out of like the 30s and, really from basically T30, T29, somewhere in there down to 43rd. That is a big drop. And that's the kind of thing where someone's like, well, maybe I won't go to that school because they're no longer in that 30 range competing with other schools. Who else was a big loser here in terms of dropping in the T50?
Yeah, and we touched on the city. We can get more specific. Boston College has got to be feeling some pain here. Definitely a further fall from grace than Harvard, since they dropped 8 points to 37th. But I wonder sometimes if the prestige that Harvard prioritizes might actually hurt more.
Yeah, and you might think to yourself, well, is that big of a deal? Well, think about this. When you look at BC, they were 29th last year. And when someone's trying to decide between 2 schools, let's say they've applied to a bunch of schools in the latter half of the T20, and then, a bunch of schools in the T30. Now, they might be comparing, the 22nd school and the 29th school. Mentally, they say to themselves, these schools are pretty similar, 22, 29, who knows, maybe BC will jump up. All of a sudden, just from a perception standpoint, and again, I say perception, not reality, 22 versus 37, it starts to feel like the 22 school might be just better. I don't think that's the case, but this is how the rankings mess with people's perceptions, where they're like, well, now BC's down 8 spots. They're no different than they were last year. They're still the same BC. They still have all their same strengths that they had previously, just like Harvard. It's just that the perception for some applicants may change a little bit. And this is kind of like a snowball. Sometimes when you start going downhill fast, it's hard to stop. And then it keeps snowballing and you have a bigger and bigger effect. But not always. Look at Wisconsin, up last year, down next year. We know there's volatility in the rankings. We know this was a weird year in general with the big LSAT scoring bubble. We had some schools increasing medians like 3 LSAT points. That's huge. You don't see those kinds of jumps. I think, you can't make any premature judgments on what this means for BC. They could easily jump back up next year. Talk to me in 2 or 3 years about where the rankings are, and we'll see.
Yeah, the instability makes this particularly tough. I was thinking about that idea of, if you compare a 29 to a 38 to a 43, which one would you choose? Well, depending on the year you pick, this last or the year before, you're at Wisconsin each time. So
that's excellent.
It really takes, I think, some of the gravity of these subtle differences out of it when you see a school's able to move that much. 14 for Wisconsin, BC dropping 8. If you can move that much year to year without really changing who you are as a school, then it testifies to the fact that these rankings are somewhat arbitrary.
I love that, because if you take that question out of context and say, well, which school, if you have these schools that are ranked this way, which school should you take? Most people will be like, I take the top ranked school. And you're like, well, that's the same school in the last 3 years. That's how much volatility there is and, range of motion inside these rankings. I love that. It also makes me think that there would be some value in doing an episode where we're like, name that school. Where we kind of went through rankings and we said, all right, this school is this, and then it was this, now it's this. Which school is it? That might be actually a fun mini quiz for the future.
Yeah, well, you think about it, in 6 months, there will be people attending Wisconsin who got into a 29th ranked school, a 38th ranked school, and a 43rd ranked school. And they're passing each other in the hallways.
You think they're pointing fingers at I got into the better ranked school? Or are they all just crying there?
Yeah,
they're all crying.
Nobody at Wisconsin is happy to see this stuff. Yes.
Love it. Well, there's a lot of bars in Madtown, so they can go out and, they'll be drinking too, but not out of joy.
So. Yeah. A couple more, and we'll finish this thing off. The biggest overall jumps that we saw, period, really, among the schools that are ranked, so the top 3 quartiles, as you mentioned. Montana, with a big leap, 31 spots they jumped, up to 103rd.
Biggest overall leap of any school.
Yes.
Why did it happen, John? Do you know?
I think it's probably that Kevin Costner show.
Yellowstone.
Yeah.
That's funny.
That's my guess.
I've had
I didn't
more
know you were
people
going to put
tell
me on
me.
the spot like that, or I would have tried to have an actual answer.
I was hoping you'd ask me because I was going to say I don't have a clue why that happened.
Well, at least I can
be honest about it. Although, isn't that more Wyoming than Montana? But I've had more people tell me to watch that show than almost any show in the last 5 years, except maybe Ted Lasso. And I've watched really half an episode, but it's not because it wasn't good. I love Costner. I think he's great, but I just haven't had time.
I've seen
another big winner.
Yeah, another big winner, closer to me, San Diego, with 22 spots gained. And, you talk about Montana jumping 31 as the biggest overall, but they're still in the hundreds. San Diego managed to climb their way into the 60s. They're now 64th. So even though it's 9 points less than Montana's movement, I think you could make an argument, a compelling argument, that San Diego had the bigger improvement. To go from 86th to 64th?
I think they're both happy.
Yeah, I'm sure.
One more in the mountains and the plains, and the other more by the beach. So again, that's an interesting choice depending upon the money. Which school do you go to, San Diego or Montana? You're looking at two very different experiences. Let's go from the winners to the losers and look at the biggest overall drops. And I was doing this last night and kind of counting them out a little bit. The two that I saw with the biggest drops were both down 21 places. One of them surprised me a little bit. It was Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to understand how Oklahoma, a state-supported school like this with big name recognition, especially in that mid kind of plains area of the U.S., would drop 21 spaces in a year. Again, it'd be nice to look inside the numbers and figure this out. And then the City University of New York also down 21. So Oklahoma went down 21 to 88th. The City University went down 21 to 133. It's kind of like the opposite Montana.
Yeah, and the opposite San Diego, Oklahoma.
Odd, really. So those are your biggest overall jumps with Montana and San Diego. These were the biggest overall drops with Oklahoma and New York there. And there was one other winner that we have on our list, John. I'll let you close it out.
We'll call it a categorical winner because there's more than one school that fits into this group. But as you mentioned, the rankings only apply to the top three quartiles. So there's this bottom 25% of schools from 147 as a position on up. I think it goes to 192 right now that don't get assigned ranks. They're just lumped into this final set. So any school that was able to climb their way out of the unranked bottom fourth and into a position where there's a number assigned, I have to think they're feeling great too. We've established ourselves, we have a place now in line. And the biggest gain that I saw there was Willamette. And by biggest gain, I mean the one that got up highest into the rankings. Willamette, apologies.
I
always do that phonetically and then realize I'm wrong. Willamette. They moved up to number 129 out of this kind of, again, log jam from 147 on up. So I don't know where they would have ranked. They didn't get ranked last year, but now they have one. 129 Willamette. And I hope they're drinking because, as you've told me, the wine there's fantastic.
Yes, the Willamette Valley's got good wine in that area. That's why I know how to say that name properly. I've actually met representatives from that school before. I was at UC Davis for an event a couple years ago, and they were the table behind us, and they were super cool. So big fan of the people at Willamette. And yes, the wine up there, good. In fact, all the Pacific Northwest wine is good and probably getting better with global warming as Napa becomes too hot. I think the Oregon and Washington wine countries are going to start having their peak moments not too long in the future.
Look at you with a silver lining.
Start buying land up there.
Well, there you go. So I think that's a pretty good rundown. We covered it all the way from the old and predictable number one into some surprises, and then we closed it out with a school that's got to be feeling good with Willamette, number 129.
Yeah. They weren't the only school to move out of that kind of bottom quartile, but they were the one that jumped the most out of that. And so that was a solid double-digit jump at the very least, 18 spaces minimum, quite possibly more. But obviously, we can't see the quartile because they don't rank it, as John said already.
Yeah, I think Regent broke out of that. Vermont broke out of that. So there were a few others. Any school that made their way into the rankings proper. Congrats.
Beautiful. Well, that's the episode right there. I must say that I have had a lot of fun with it.
This is fun. It feels like hugely consequential to the people listening, but I know from our perspective, and I hope we've helped to maybe infect them a bit with this, it's fun to talk about this stuff, but this is not the life and death that so many other issues with this process feel like they can be.
No, and these rankings are arbitrary, so don't put too much weight into them. They change every year. A big riser can drop next year. Look at Wisconsin. You've got schools that fall and then rise back up. You've got schools that stay roughly in the same band year after year. So look at it over the long term and use it as one little piece. Don't use it as the be-all, end-all. And I think that'll take you to the promised land with the kind of like greatest amount of stability in the way you're viewing things. Jon, any final comments?
Not me, man. I'm off to pour another drink and pack some suitcases badly.
Yes, we'll be back in a couple weeks after you go through your trip. Enjoy Augusta. Have a fun time at the Masters.
Yeah, it should be a good time.
Your hometown golf tournament. Not my hometown, but that's where we met. So have a drink for me when you're there.
You can count on that.
All right. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment or rating. If you have any questions, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. I have a feeling that when Jon returns, we'll probably do a mailbag relatively soon. So that might be that episode. So if you have something that's pressing, please send that to us. On behalf of Jon and myself, we hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe out there.